Good evening. The Ufo Sunset is a passage, a daily rite. It guides one from the light into the darkness. The kids these days are all about the liminal. But the saucers aren't liminal, no. The saucers are the opposite of a passage. They are a wall, masquerading as a hall. One thinks when they see the light that they have found a way through. Instead, they have run into a solid, opaque object, a boundary. What seems far is really right in front of you. What seems large is really little. What seems to be endlessly retreating is really just staying in one place. One walks and walks, but their feet simply land on the same spot again and again. The psychopomp's job is to guide one along the wall by making them turn and move laterally. Don't go towards the saucer, says the spirit of the night. Don't follow the dark path. It's a trap. Go this way instead. Liminality is just passé to the saucers. The Greys don't want you to go forward. They want you to get stuck and stay there forever. But who even is one? It's just as the night butterfly always says in my ear, don't listen to the candy in your heart. Listen only to the hard tack. You can't follow the sunset into the light. You can only follow it into the night. And once it's that time of day, nobody can help but to follow the sunset. Kids these days are all about the synchronicities. But if I were to look to all the patterns, I would burn everything around me into a pile of ashen butterfly scales. Synchronicities, they're just the lines on the wall. Look to the left, look to the right. All around us is the real sync drop, except for the self-referentializing, steely-eyed wall that smushes my nose. Tinseltown has followed me from Tinseltown to gray adorable city by the docks, and we're a chorus singing, I want the world to stop. Remember that episode of Friends? The one where everyone watched the skies for satellites during the International Geophysical Year? Well, it wasn't an episode of Friends. It was Operation Moonwatch. A new study finds. And we're currently amidst the autumnal equinox, folks. The autumnal equinox, folks. You know what that means. Everything is interdependent and interpenetrating. A new study finds. Plus, Roswell was balloons, dude. A new study finds. An old new study finds. A really old new study finds. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Jeff Knox.
I'm Luis Cayetano.
Welcome to Ufo Sunset.
Those images, those night angels, kind of remind me of that Kevin Costner movie, Dragonfly. Have you seen that? Where it's like his wife or girlfriend dies or something, and there's a life after death kind of thing. Like he has these there's different levels of consciousness, they say, and different levels of death, and it's kind of a weird movie, but there's kind of like weird kind of light phenomenon, I think, in that movie like that he sees. That are they angels? Are they Mothman? Are they very Keelian Mothman kind of thing, but with Kevin Costner, called Dragonfly.
Never seen it before.
Yeah, I'll have to watch it again.
All right. And now for the rebrief. A raptor lost for 50 years was photographed for the first time. Last recorded in 1969, the New Britain goshawk was photographed for the first time earlier this year. This goshawk species is native to the island of New Britain in Papua New Guinea, and their status is considered vulnerable on the IUCN Red List of Endangered Species. The bird was photographed by Tom Vieras during a trip from Fiji with the World Wildlife Federation, or WWF, in March. According to Oscar Peeling, the region's WWF officer, sightings of the goshawk are rare even for locals of the island. Mosquitoes are on the rise. On Friday, New York State's Health Department reported that a resident of Ulster County, about 100 miles north of New York City, was diagnosed with Eastern equine encephalitis, or EEE, a virus that's spread by mosquitoes. This marks the first case of EEE in New York State since 2015. There have been 10 reported cases of the virus in the United States this year, including one death in New Hampshire. According to the CDC, the highest number of infections of EEE occurred in 2019, totaling 38 cases in the country. Meanwhile, in June, the Southern Nevada Health District reported that over 3,000 mosquitoes in that portion of the state were found to contain the West Nile virus. This is the highest numbers in recorded history. These are the highest numbers in recorded history, Anthony Fauci, the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, during the COVID-19 lockdown, was infected with the West Nile virus this summer. According to a story in U.S. News and World Report earlier this month, experts are expressing concerns over the effect of climate change on mosquito populations. For example, Dr. William Schaffner, a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee. The warmer summer and milder winter last year led to an increase in mosquito populations, while warmer summers allow viruses to multiply faster within individual mosquitoes, increasing the likelihood that they could infect humans. In the same story, Dr. Aaron Glatt, a spokesman for the Infectious Diseases Society of America, reportedly said that the dengue fever likely poses an even greater threat, with over 4,100 cases reported across 46 states as of August. The Vos swifts disappeared from Chapman. The Vos swifts disappeared from Chapman Elementary School. On Wednesday, the Bird Alliance of Oregon reported that nearly all of the Vos swifts have stopped showing up to roost in the chimney at Chapman Elementary School. The swifts begin to congregate in large numbers around roosts like the Chapman Elementary chimney in the late summer before migrating south. Although Chapman Elementary is not the only roost for Vos swifts in the Portland area, it's the most famous one. In past years, as many as 15,000 swifts could be seen gathering each evening at the chimney. So it's become a tradition in the last few decades for locals to gather there in crowds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds or even over 1,000, to watch the birds as they enter the chimney to roost. This year, the number of swifts peaked at only 5,430 on September 2nd, and then petered out to nearly zero last week, which is extremely unusual. While there is no clear explanation for why this is, one suggestion from the Bird Alliance of Oregon is that predators, such as Cooper's hawks and American crows, are lingering later in the area and scaring the swifts to new roosting sites. And now, for Mr. Jeff Knox. You're muted, Jeff.
All right, cool. Hello, hello, hello. All right, today we are going to be talking about Operation Moonwatch. Mostly Operation Moonwatch. It says Operation Moonwatch and UFOs, and I'll share a couple of quick cases on UFOs at the very end. But mostly I got really interested in learning about Operation Moonwatch. I ended up reading a really great book about this by a guy named W. Patrick McRae called Keep Watching the Skies. And so I ended up digging into Moonwatch a little bit more than some of the later UFO cases. So what I plan to do is the cases that I don't get to today, I'll do as an add-on next week with the chat episode. But today we're going to be talking about Operation Moonwatch, which is a fascinating project, probably the first kind of large-scale citizen science project that kind of took place. And I think it's very, very, very cool. So Operation Moonwatch was a groundbreaking citizen science project initiated by Fred L. Whipple, who was director of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory in 1956 as part of what was called the International Geophysical Year. Now, the Geophysical Year was a 67-nation scientific effort that was kind of the brainchild of Lloyd Berkner. Lloyd Berkner was basically the president of this international association of scientific unions, and he had met with a bunch of people, a few other people, and I believe James Van Allen of the Van Allen Belt's house, and they were discussing what was called the International Polar Year, and they had thought that there should be an International Geophysical Year that focused kind of more on the geophysical sciences and not like expeditions like the Arctic. And Lloyd Berkner is also pretty well known in UFO circles for being part of the Robinson panel and other ties he had to kind of the UFO topic. But he came up with this idea for this International Geophysical Year that would take place between July 1st, 1957 and the very end of the year, 1958. So it's a year, but technically it's a year and a half. And this effort was launched during the height of the space race. Whipple aimed to recruit amateur astronomers and other citizens to help assist professional scientists in tracking satellites. Because as part of Moonwatch, both our country and Russia was planning to launch the first artificial Earth satellites into orbit. And so they needed a way to track these satellites. And he envisioned Moonwatch as a way that the public could help engage with scientific research and to complement the established tracking stations that would later be set up. However, with the launch of Sputnik 1 in late 1957, October 4th, 1957, and the tracking cameras, the Baikonur stations, not yet complete, Moonwatchers became vital to providing the initial observations to the global tracking network established by the scientists. And here you can kind of see an organizational slide for the satellite tracking program, where you had the different groups that would be involved. And there was kind of a multiple-pronged stepped approach to this. There would be the tracking camera stations. The Naval Research Laboratory developed these mini-track kind of radios, these kind of like ham radio setups that would track the satellite's radio signals. Only these satellites only had batteries for not that long. Like that radio, that famous Sputnik beep would only go for like a week or something before the batteries died, but it would be visibly in orbit for potentially months after that. And so they needed a multi-pronged approach. So they had the radio setups. They had these the tracking cameras they were building. They had these amateur groups that would feed in to the communication center and their computing center, and they would then take that data to calculate these orbits, which they could then use to further kind of track the satellites and whatnot. And this is the Baikonur satellite tracking cameras, and this is really these were designed by a guy named Joseph Baker. Joseph Baker was the guy who had designed the Super Schmidt meteor cameras that were used in Harvard's earlier meteor program. And a guy named Joseph Nunn, so he designed the optics. A guy named Joseph Nunn designed the mechanical stuff, the base and the platform and whatnot, and created these 12 Baker-Nunn satellite tracking cameras that would be put in stations, specifically stations around the world that would be able to track these satellites. But in order to know where to point these big, heavy cameras, and in order to reduce the amount of cameras that they would need, because these are big, expensive cameras, so to minimize the amount you would need of these big, slow-moving cameras, they needed to know where to point them, so they could only, make so many of these things. And that's where these amateurs really kind of came in. So the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory was the one who was assigned the responsibility of setting up this worldwide network of optical tracking stations to follow these Earth's artificial satellites. Now, in order to help out with this, Fred Whipple hired Dr. J.L.N. Hynek of Ohio State University to act as director of the Optical Satellite Tracking Program, STP. Hynek would take a leave of absence from Ohio State in January 1956 and travel to Cambridge to work on the project. He would eventually leave the project, and I believe the end of 1959, to become the chairman of the Department of Astronomy when he would move to Northwestern University. Now, the concept was pretty straightforward. You have teams of observers worldwide would track, time, and record these satellite passes over their location. They would then send this data back to the computing center that you kind of saw on that chart in Cambridge, Massachusetts, using methods either of a telephone, Western Union, or ham radio. And from my understanding is the most effective method of the telephone worked best. So what they would do is they would first telephone in a report, and then they would follow it up with like a secondary kind of note or confirmation by telegram. Ham radio, I guess, turned out to be pretty unreliable for sending in reports. And then this information would then help the engineers kind of determine where to aim these large Baker known cameras. And here we have a photo at the MIT Computation Center in Cambridge in October with Fred Whipple standing next to an IBM staff member. Now, in order to calculate these orbits, it was kind of a complex process. You needed to not only know the exact positions of the people making the observations, and they didn't have GPS back then. There was no high level accuracy positional coordinates on the Earth's surface at the time. And this is actually something that this project helped get, is better positional measurements and accuracy of the Earth's surface and distances between points on the Earth's surface. So you needed to know that. You needed to also know exact, precise time measurements of when they saw the satellite in order to send this data back and it to be useful to be calculated to kind of determine these orbits. And there's also orbits are kind of complex too, because not only do you have the satellite orbiting around the Earth, at the same time, the Earth is rotating at about 1,700 miles west or east for every rotation of the satellite. And then that satellite wobbles on its orbit every 50 days and ends up flipping around. And so it's really complex. You have to know a lot of very accurate details in order to calculate the orbits of these satellites, and they depended on this computation center to do that. But because of these precise details that were needed, they didn't allow lone wolf observers, right? You couldn't just be an amateur astronomer, say you saw it and send in your information. You had to be part of these teams because they would precisely figure out where these positions of these stations they set up were, these optical fences that they would set up. They would know precise exact times, and they needed kind of like a project coordinator to kind of filter out stuff that, potentially had other kind of explanations. And so reports could only be sent into the center by the Moonwatch team leader. Individual team members could not send in the reports or act as lone wolf observers in the Moonwatch program, at least until the mid-1960s. Now, recruitment for the program commenced pretty quickly. And here we can see one team, I believe in Japan, of young men on a Moonwatch team. And here's a couple other people. The lady up top actually works for the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, and she's kind of demonstrating a Moonwatch kind of telescope. And so they started recruiting immediately. And in July 1956, the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory would release its first bulletin for visual observers of satellites. This bulletin was published in Sky and Telescope, and they would publish these. I'm pretty sure they were all published in Sky and Telescope. At least all the ones that I found were published in Sky and Telescope. And in this journal, they would officially adopt the name Moonwatch for the program. There was actually two kind of names, I believe, on the table. Besides the Moonwatch was Seesaw. And there's a reason for that name. So when you were a Moonwatch observer and you were sitting there and watching your scope, waiting for a satellite to hopefully cross through your field of view, when you saw that satellite first into your field of view, you would say, I see the satellite. And then the second you say left the field of view, you would say, I saw the satellite. And while this was happening, they had tape recorders going with time coding, and that would record the precise measurements of when they saw see the satellite and when they saw the satellite, so they know exactly when it was field of view. And so that I saw became the nickname for the project that was used by people throughout the project, Operation Seesaw. But the official name was actually Project Moonwatch, and they decided to go with that in this issue of the very first bulletin of the Visual Observers of Satellites. Now, there are certainly challenges that still needed to be addressed. The beacon and cameras at this point were behind schedule, and the entire system was struggling to get operational by mid-1958 for the International Geophysical Year. School and community groups still needed to be organized. They needed to be trained. They needed to be equipped. And many people have questioned the effectiveness of amateurs to be able to make useful contributions to this project. And additionally, there was concerns about whether or not they'd even be able to see the satellite, how the satellite would appear to an observer on the ground. Because you have to recall, these satellites were roughly 21 inches in diameter, 21 inch sphere. And at its nearest point to Earth, its perigee was something like 260 miles. And its highest point, something like 700 or 800 miles. And that's just Sputnik. Sputnik was actually, as you'll see, relatively close to Earth compared to the later satellites. And so you're seeing a 21-inch ball hundreds of miles away. Somebody says it's kind of like looking at a golf ball, like miles down the road or something. So these things are very small, and people wondered if they'd even be able to see them, if they would be bright enough to see them, because while they were like Sputnik and stuff were really reflective, they kind of had this kind of like gold, kind of really shiny metallic kind of coating on it to kind of reflect the sunlight. It didn't really have any artificial lights or anything else to kind of like make it visible. And so there was some real doubt as to whether or not these people could even actually see these things. So they came up with kind of these specifications that would be necessary for these scopes in order to view, the satellite. And they determined that the brightness of the satellite were ranged basically from scarcely naked eye visibility to between 8th and 9th magnitude, and averaging about a magnitude 7. So when it was at its perigee, which is at its closest point to Earth in its orbit, it averaged about a 7, which is fairly close to possibly the dimmest star you might be able to see visually with your eye. But when it was at its apogee, or further away from Earth, its magnitude went up to like 8 or 9 on average. And so they figured they would need an instrument with an aperture of at least 50 millimeters. They wanted something with a magnification power of 6 to 7, and that had a field of view of about 10 to 12 degrees. And what they would do is that you would have an overlapping field of view. So each scope would have maybe about 12 degrees field of view, and that would overlap with the person next to them by about a degree and a half. That way there was always overlap and there was no gap in the coverage of this kind of optical fence. And you can kind of see the importance of where how big the field of view would come into play here, is because depending on field of view would depend on how many volunteers you would need in a fence line in order to get coverage. If your circular field of view of your scope was only 8 inches as compared to, say, 12 inches, you would need significantly more observers to cover the same arc of sky as you would with a scope with a larger field of view. And as Amy mentioned, there's only really 2 points at which you would even be able to see these satellites in the sky. So the observer needed to be on the dark side of the Earth. It needs to be in the Earth's shadow because you couldn't see it if it was sunlight, right? But the satellite needed to be high enough that it wasn't in the shadow, that it was at a point where the sunlight was still reflecting off of it. So that gave you basically 2 windows in which you would have the possible window to be able to see these satellites. That was twilight in the morning when we were still in the Earth's shadow, but the satellite was high enough to get in the sun, and then again at dawn. And so depending on where you were, kind of depended on how long your window was. They said usually you had about a 40-minute window to potentially observe this. During apogee, when it's further away, you have a bit longer window if you can pick it up with your scope because it's further away, up to maybe 100 minutes. And they say in rare cases, you might even be able to observe 2 orbits of the satellite. But while they're doing this, all these people in a line, at most 1, maybe 2 people would ever have seen it cross through their field of view. So you have that whole line providing a fence, but that satellite is only actually going to cross the meridian in the field of view of one of the people, probably completely, if they catch it at all. And the person next to them might get a little bit left in their field of view. So most of the people won't see anything, but you needed that fence to be able to catch it. And they had to put these teams on alert during these specific times a day at which the satellite would even be visible. And they did some kind of trial test to kind of train these kind of people to learn how to use the equipment, to report their sightings. And so they did a couple of variety of simulations and alerts to kind of hopefully get the team ready for the project when the satellites actually did launch. And they even used civil air patrol groups, conducted experiments with various substitutes, such as following aircraft, flocks of birds, bats at dusk, even tracking pebbles thrown into the sky. Eventually, they actually even created a machine, an apparatus that used like a very dim red light that wouldn't affect your night vision, that they could use to simulate the movement of the satellite to help train the teams. But one of the things they did that was kind of very, very interesting, they called it the plumber's satellite. And so they took a civilian air patrol plane, and at the end of 100 feet of clothesline, it was fitted with a plumber's helper, as a plunger that had some batteries and a 1/10 candle power bulb. And this plane flew low over the city, basically simulating the motion of the satellite. And the dim bulb would give off enough light, and the teams on the ground would see if they could be able to track it. However, there's a fairly interesting story about one of these kind of pilots who did one of these simulations where he was arrested after flying one of these simulation missions. This guy, James Salmon, although one of the articles says his name is Gene Salmon. This one says Gene, but other articles say James Salmon. Was out flying in New Orleans, low over the city. And when he got back, he actually got arrested by the sheriff for essentially drunken driving, but intoxicated flying, because the sheriff's claimed that he got a lot of complaints that he was basically harassing and bothering the townspeople flying low over the town and whatnot. And so this guy got arrested for intoxicated flying. He had a passenger with him, this 36-year-old redheaded barmaid from Texas that apparently had met the night before and had taken up on a moonlight flight. She supposedly had drinking 3 beers. She was arrested for vagrancy. And so even after apparently the civilian air patrol told the sheriff that, and this guy told the sheriff as well, that this was the Operation Moonwatch simulation flight that he was performing. He wasn't out there, like terrorizing the town, flying low, buzzing houses like people were claiming. The sheriff didn't seem to care and still arrested this guy. And this is a cool story. I just heard briefly in the book, but there was really no references. The only reference in the book was an unknown news clip. And I actually spent several hours yesterday digging through newspapers, finding articles about this story because I kind of thought it was very interesting. It's kind of a wild story in general that involves something about her losing her underwear on a football or a baseball game or some sort of game, a football bowl, I think. And I don't know what that has to do with anything. It's a wild, crazy, weird story that has to do with Operation Moonwatch. I don't know if he ever got the charges dropped or if we went to court and he was prosecuted. So I'm not sure what the completion of the story is, but it's a fairly interesting story of a guy getting arrested for drunk flying while ostensibly performing Operation Moonwatch flight. It's a little unclear if that's actually true or not. He did do these simulations, but depending on the source, some people say it wasn't actually a scheduled simulation. So it's also possible this guy was just flying this lady he met up on one of these simulation flights to kind of show her, a cool time or whatever. But either way, an Operation Moonlight pilot got arrested for flying a simulation mission over New Orleans. Back to Moonwatch. So, on October 4th, 1957, the world was taken a bit by surprise as Sputnik 1 launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, stunning many with the realization that the Soviets had outpaced the West in the space race. At that point, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which would later become NASA in 1958, had not yet reached a successful orbital launch. Only a handful of Moonwatch teams were even ready to observe its first dust passes over the United States. And it's important to note that Sputnik was kind of too small and too faint to be seen with the naked eye. In fact, what most casual observers actually witnessed was much like the scenes of the movie October Sky, the opening scenes of that movie, was not Sputnik. It was actually the rocket booster that launched Sputnik into orbit. And so with the launch of Sputnik, Operation Moonwatch volunteers suddenly found themselves in the spotlight. Newspapers and radio shows rushed to interview them as public interest soared. Moonwatchers, a guy named Larry Ock, part of the Columbus, Ohio team, was actually the first person to see Sputnik in the United States from his watch post. And a second observation was seen by the Terre Haute, Indiana Moonwatch team. But the guy in charge of Moonwatch, this Armand Spitz, would say that 2 weeks later, so 14 days after Sputnik had launched, there was only 10 real sightings total of Sputnik. All the other sightings people believe they have were actually of the much brighter rocket that launched Sputnik into orbit, not Sputnik itself. Moonwatchers also tracked and documented the launch of the dog Laika aboard Sputnik 2 on November 3rd, 1957. And when the U.S. finally launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, on February 1st, 1958, Operation Moonwatch was there to track it as well. Magazines like Life, Boys Life, Popular Mechanics, Popular Science, etc., published articles on the project encouraging people to get involved. And when Sputnik 4 was re-entered into the U.S. atmosphere on September 1962, it was actually data from Moonwatch teams that provided crucial information to allow them to find and recover the crash parts of Sputnik, which were then eventually returned to Russia. Moonwatch teams employed a unique method in order to avoid neck strain from prolonged observation. So these people would have to be sitting at a chair for up to 90 minutes at a time. And so the criteria for people that could be involved had to also take into consideration things like health issues, like could you sit for 90 minutes without having to leave to go to the bathroom? Could you comfortably maintain your observation without falling asleep? Because it was crucial that you did not miss any of that potentially up to 90 minutes at a time of watching the sky. In cases where you might need to step away, you needed to have a backup next to you to step in immediately for the observation. But preferably you wanted people that could sit there the whole time and watch. And so because the potential neck strain involved if you were looking up at a telescope, these telescopes were designed so you were looking up by looking down. They used a bench-mounted scope aimed at a reflective plate, so it had a mirror that was aimed skyward. Observers were then ranged in a line with overlapping field of view, which effectively created that virtual optical fence I was talking about for tracking the satellites. They would call out when a target crossed the local meridian, and then this information was recorded on site for transmission. And you can see here, you would have your row observers, and they would have a big metal, kind of like a cross point, that would be the focusing point. And every single observer on that line would be focusing their telescopes so it's centered at that cross. And so how that would work out is that each observer then would be seeing in their field of view a different arc of the sky along that meridian, along that arc up there. And if you had enough observers in a line, you could cover the entire arc of the sky and have complete coverage if the satellite was to pass through your field of view. Again, that's that Japanese team. Again, we see these, you have the different lines and they all kind of focus on that cross there. Several companies offered telescopes for Moonwatch participants. For $49.50, amateur astronomers could purchase a satellite scope from Edmund Scientific, which featured a wide field of view and magnification of about 5.5 times. Now, that's a lot of money. $49.50 at that time in today's dollars, I believe, is closer to $500 something. So, it was a pretty significant investment for someone in the 1950s to buy one of these scopes. Now, while many teams opted for commercially available scopes, others would choose to build their own scopes following simple designs encouraged by the Smithsonian for those that were familiar with basic construction. And here we can see the kind of the schematics of a scope that was published in Science and Mechanics magazine that people could construct. There was another scope published in Popular Mechanics in August 1957 on building a Moonwatch scope. This issue also had another article on the Moonwatch project. This article on building the scope is kind of an add-on they also included in the magazine. And later on, they would actually outfit some of the teams with these different scopes called apogee scopes. Because the problem so I mentioned Sputnik was fairly close to the Earth as far as the orbit goes. But with Explorer 1 and our US satellites, they knew that the distance of the orbit could be as far out as 2,500 miles. And the standard Moonwatch scopes just didn't have the optical resolution to pick up these satellites that, instead of being an average magnitude of 7 or 8 or 9, were more like 11 or 12 magnitude. And so they needed a larger scope in order to be able to detect these very faint objects. And so they basically decided to set up 7 of what they call these apogee stations using these apogee scopes. And these apogee scopes were kind of constructed using, there was a scope called the M117 scope that was a military scope. They took the prism and the eyepiece from that and attached it to the optics from a ship binocular to create this apogee scope that they then created a mount for. And this scope would give them the power that they needed to detect these newer satellites launched into orbit that would be in an orbit much further away from the Earth. And so they set up 7 of these apogee stations kind of like along around the way. Now, the number of Moonwatch teams would reach its highest point in 1958, with approximately 230 teams worldwide formally registered with the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. In the United States alone, 128 teams were registered, and over 80% conducted productive observing sessions, totaling over 1,659 observing sessions that generated over 3,500 scientifically useful observations. Data collected by these teams played a vital role in enhancing our understanding of satellite orbits. The program also led to new data on the upper atmosphere, more accurate data on the size and shape of the Earth, more precise distances between points on our planet's surface, and a variety of other interesting discoveries. And if people want to know more about how it got new important data on the upper atmosphere and how the satellites helped figure that out, they can ask me later. After the International Geophysical Year concluded, the Smithsonian continued Operation Moonwatch with some support from NASA until 1975. And in this photo in 1975, at the end of Operation Moonwatch, we can see not just Fred Lawrence Whipple, who was the director of the observatory and founder of the project. The guy in the middle here holding the Moonwatch scope is Frederick C. Durant III, which is another figure that should be known to UFO people. Frederick C. Durant III was a CIA guy that was involved in the Robertson panel. In fact, when people talk about the Robinson panel report, they're actually typically referring to the Durant report. The Durant report, Durant was with the CIA and he attended the meeting. And he had wrote this report, and it contained the Robinson panel plus additional commentary. Because the Robinson panel is NSA, he was CIA, so it's different reports. Durant's reports is a little bit more complete. And not only was Durant involved with the Robinson panel and other groups like NICAP and whatnot, and you can look at Expanding Frontiers Research has some FOI documents from the FBI and whatnot that they had acquired on Frederick C. Durant. But he was also involved in the later 1980 association, the AAASS UFO Symposium in 1980. Frederick C. Durant was the moderator of that with Carl Sagan and Page and all that stuff. And Robert Schaefer and all those, Alan Hendry and all those cool guys were at that. And so that guy does have a UFO connection as well. There's a lot of these people involved in this have connections to the UFO topic kind of already. And in the US, enthusiasm for Moonwatch reflected this vibrant culture of amateur science in the post-war period. Participating in Moonwatch was a rare opportunity for a non-professional with an interest in science where he could make relevant contributions to the advancement of sciences. And everyone from Hynek to Whipple had said that the amateur scientists would make critical and crucial observations as part of this project. Now, it's not the first time the U.S. government has enlisted the help of the common citizenry to keep a lookout for things. During the Cold War, citizens were encouraged to participate in the Ground Observer Corps, which was a program aimed at having civilians basically spot Soviet bombers. In fact, the Ground Observer Corps even listed prisoners and various other people in helping to look for potential enemy planes flying over. My grandpa was part of the Ground Observer Corps, like many people, and he showed me his Ground Observer card once and his guide and whatnot. So there were these kind of citizen kind of collaborative projects before, but that was more of a military national security nature. Moonwatch was really the first time that not only could you feel your desire to be patriotic and help support your country, but you were also helping provide real legitimate scientific contributions that made a difference. And it was really the first large-scale project to kind of do this and kind of set the path for later projects that would kind of come along. Operation Moonwatch was not only significant because of these scientific contributions, but also for fostering public interest in astronomy and space exploration. It demonstrated the potential of citizen engagement in scientific research, paving the way for future initiatives that would leverage public participation in scientific endeavors. And you can see that it really grabbed the attention of a wide variety of people. It wasn't just one kind of class or group of people. You had children, you had Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, housewives, scientists, engineers, gas station attendants. Everyone from all walks of life participated and was interested in this project. And it brought all these people together in this scientific endeavor. And it really underscored the importance of collaboration between both professional scientists and amateur enthusiasts, highlighting the shared passion for discovery and knowledge that they both have. So how does this kind of relate to UFOs? First of all, in late 1957, Science Newsletters published a short article on Moonwatch, kind of essentially using Moonwatch to debunk UFOs and portraying a thing we've kind of heard a lot, like astronomers don't see UFOs kind of message. This article concludes, astronomers point out that not one saucer has been reported as the result of astronomical observations. Considering the number of newspaper reports concerning strange flying objects, they believe this lack of astronomical data is impressive. Besides the astronomical telescopes and cameras working in all parts of the country every clear night, there are now hundreds of Moonwatch teams on the lookout for the glimpse of one of the Sputniks. Not one of them has reported seeing flying saucers, yet they maintain a careful vigil on a strip of the sky directly overhead from horizon to horizon. Now, contrary to this public statement, unidentified objects actually started appearing in Moonwatch observations almost immediately. In fact, there's observations by teams before Moonwatch kind of started to kick off. Jan Hynek would acknowledge that not only were these unidentified sightings frequently reported by the teams, they were also photographed using the Baker-Nunn telescope cameras. The CUFOS archives contains a substantial collection of documents related to this, often referred to as the Hynek CUFOS Moonwatch file. And this is something you can go check out this PDF yourself and scroll through all this stuff if you want. And this file contains various items such as actual Moonwatch reports, observations from participants that were, say, part of Moonwatch, but outside of their official Moonwatch duties. And a lot of these cases do come from Moonwatch teams, but the sighting wasn't when they were on a specific observation for a satellite. It was on one of their just other times they were kind of watching the sky. It also contains citizen witness reports, some military reports, and a variety of newspaper articles about satellite observations. Additionally, there's a partial draft proposal by Jacques Vallée that cites at least 36 of these reports that he proposed for a larger study. Now, this study was never undertaken, but he created this proposal where he hoped to study these 36 cases. And it is from these collections of cases that I will share some examples with you. And I have just two real quick to share with you. There's a list of these 36 cases, and the rest I'll share next week. Our first case, and the first case on the list, involves a group of astronomers who see this vivid pink object moving slowly across the sky. And this takes place near Canberra, Australia, at the Mount Stromlo Observatory. And it's 3:03 a.m., and the Polish-Australian astronomer Antoni Przybylski and Dutch-American astronomer Bart Bok see a vivid pink object moving slowly across the sky at Mount Stromlo Observatory near Canberra. It is visible to the naked eye for 2 minutes. Przybylski has just finished observing Sputnik 1 and 2, so he knows it wasn't the satellite or a meteor. Assistant Director Arthur Robert Hogg thinks it might be circling the Earth like a satellite. Now, we unfortunately don't have a whole lot of information on this case besides for what they saw and what they published kind of in these newspaper articles. This sighting is a little early to show up in those Moonwatch files, which kind of, the CUFOS files kind of started in 1958. So this is a little bit early of a sighting, and it's not directly Moonwatch related. It's just an astronomer sighting, so it's kind of included in here, and it was included on Vallée's list. So it's one interesting thing to note about this case is Bart Bok, who was the kind of the director kind of this observatory, is a colleague of Donald Menzel's, actually, and was kind of a bit of his own sort of a debunker. So a lot of people think that Menzel was kind of put on the debunking path. They've got this conspiracy theory that it was from the Psychological Strategy Board that kind of put him up to debunking stuff. That's just not actually true. Menzel and Bok's boss at Harvard kind of Shapley got together with them and each assigned them a different task. Menzel was given the task of UFOs to help debunk. Bart Bok, involved in this sighting, was given the task of debunking astrology. And so it was their boss Shapley that actually told these guys to kind of look into these fringe topics that are affecting science and kind of see what you can do to kind of debunk them. And so Bart, while a debunker in his own right, apparently was still kind of quite confused about this sighting. And the director of this observatory just kind of said that they, haven't seen anything like this before. And yeah, I will say what Amy says is when this whole project started, the idea was that they were going to be watching our satellite first, not the Sputnik satellite. Like when this all started, it was part of this Project Vanguard and the satellite tracking project for our launch of the satellite. Only they kind of beat us to it and caught us kind of off guard by a bit, even though we kind of knew they were launching or were going to launch. And it wasn't actually that much a surprise to the people involved that Sputnik launched first. Initially, the idea was that our satellite was going to launch first. It just never actually happened. Now, our last case here involves a Moonwatch team in San Antonio who see these silver objects kind of go through the field of view. Now, this image here says 1960. That's actually a a typo in Michael Sword's article in the UFO Reporter. It's 1959. And in this case, we had two observers, and they both sent in these kind of letters listing their observations. And there's the first observer and there's the second observer kind of here, sending a letter. Now, these two observers on a Project Moonwatch team in San Antonio, Texas, see two silvery objects through their telescope that shoot across the sky in less than 1 second. One curving away in a parabolic path, the other executing a more kind of hyperbolic curve. And so just a little bit more detail in this case. What happened was there was two observers. There was these first two observers, and they were observing the same section of sky. And that's what these two circles are at the top here. And they were pointed at the exact same place. One was viewing the left field of view and the other was viewing the right field of view. And so the person on the left kind of saw this object come in at about, and most of these Moonwatch observations are drawn like this, these circular views. And this would be just the field of view that you had looking through the telescope. When they were tracking the satellites, in order to kind of provide like a map, they would also include what stars like were visible, the constellations, so you could match up, with where they were pointing as well. And so looking through the scope, this first person in their field of view saw it coming in at about 340 degrees and then leave in a parabolic curve at about 265 degrees. The person next to him, looking at the same section of the sky, just a slightly different field of view, saw it come in a more hyperbolic curve, coming at 30 degrees and exiting his field of view at 150. I can't read that. 195 degrees. Now, it turns out there was actually a third witness that the next day wrote up that second letter and turned this kind of in. And he had seen it with his telescope in the bottom right-hand quadrant of his field of view. And it came in again in this parabolic curve at about 95 to 100 degrees and left again at about 170, 175 degrees. So supposedly, if I recall, it couldn't, I think they're trying to say it couldn't be the same object. It was just like different objects at the same time, but because of the way the fields of view are, like they couldn't have been seeing the exact same object. But I'd have to go back and reread that. But most of the Moonwatch cases kind of come down to sketches like this of what they were seeing when they were watching the sky, for whatever they were watching the sky, whether it was a specific alert to watch a satellite or whether they were watching it for something else. I believe at this time they were looking for, there was a mystery satellite that they thought was orbiting, and they were on a mission to try and see if they could spot this mystery satellite to try and collect more data. And that's when they observed this thing, which they said was not, I believe they did calculations and said it wasn't actually, I'm just gonna stop there because I don't remember what they said. I thought they said it might have been close, like closer, like not in orbit, but I'd have to double check. So that's just two of the cases of the 36. I'll do a couple more for you guys next week, but that's all I had time to kind of wrap up to do today. Just another quick photo here. This is actually the day after Sputnik, the night Sputnik launched. This was printed on October 5th, 1957. And so this would have been taken on October 4th. And we have Kenneth Drummond, which is an administrator for the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory. We have J. Allen Hynek on the right here, and his secretary, Marilyn Dawson, in Cambridge. And Drummond here has the scope, the Moonwatch scope in his hands, and he's looking up, look at the sky, trying to catch Sputnik. And the launch of Sputnik kept Hynek really, really busy. As you saw at the beginning, he was on the front cover of Life magazine in, I believe, October 21st, 1957. And him and Whipple, kind of became super famous at the time because they were the main kind of point of contact for information about Sputnik and the satellite that was just launched, because they were the ones tracking the orbits. Let me see here real quick. I want to see if I can show you that again. So this photo on the right is the cover that's on Life magazine minus the Life magazine stuff that was added to it. It's the same photo. And you can see J. Allen Hynek at the very top there of the globe. It's a pretty famous photo. And Whipple there on the left. I'm unsure who the guy on the right is. At this time, another famous UFO guy, Walter Webb, who was the first guy to investigate the Betty and Barney Hill case and is heavily involved in NICAP, actually worked for Hynek during 1957 and worked on one of the Baker 9 tracking stations. So Walter Webb was actually assigned to Hynek during this time period as well. And it was because Hynek was involved with this International Geophysical Year project in 1957 and the satellite tracking project that he was kind of absent from UFO investigations during the 1957 flap, like the leveling case and whatnot. In fact, Fred Whipple himself actually looked at the leveling case because he was sent data, I guess, after it happened, and Hynek was discussing it with Fred Whipple. And so, yeah, Fred Whipple was involved with that as well. Fred Whipple would later it's kind of interesting. He was involved with a fringe documentary called Target Earth in like 1981. Mostly just using his expertise as a scientist about like comets, talking about the Tunguska incident. But that's the last time I kind of found footage of him. But he wrote the introduction to Menzel's book, The UFO Enigma, with an introduction to Dr. Fred L. Whipple. So all these guys, a lot of UFO guys involved in this project, a lot of UFO guys peripherally related to this project in one way or another. And as you can imagine, a lot of UFO sightings kind of came out of this project. Only they didn't call them UFOs. They called them unidentified objects. They called them UOs, is what the official terminology was. That'll do it for today. Back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Balloons. They are crazy. Some people see them and think that they're UFOs. Some people are quite terrified of them. The way they make that squeaky sound, the way they float about as though they have a mind of their own, and the way they pop with a loud sound. This fear has a name, globophobia. And it may seem strange, it may often be irrational, but in the end, these flying globes really are dangerous and really should be feared, within reason, of course. Have there been animal balloons or plant balloons, wild balloons that just arose out of nature like worms or wolves, perhaps to hunt and kill, perhaps to cause natural disasters? Who knows? Nobody. Because to our present knowledge, there are no balloons in nature which were not made by human hands. Well, aside from maybe sea foam and the bubbles from the bubble bush, an argument could be made that those are in essence balloons, but their surfaces are made of liquid, so they never last very long before just disappearing. So how is it that nature is full of balloons, crowded with them even? Why are there far too many balloons threatening us from the sky? Well, because long before the era of airplanes and helicopters in some time forgotten, ancient humans invented high aerial technology for its use in hunting, ancient entertainments, and even in psychological warfare. What? Ancient high aerial technology? What am I talking about here? I'm talking ballistic missiles, I'm talking rockets, I'm talking kites, and I'm talking ancient balloons. People have been making them for quite possibly thousands of years, and they still make them today. Nowadays, they're much more sophisticated, they're much more common. They're still mysterious somehow. They crowd our skies, and they are a threat. Now, as I said, although there are some flying bubbles and foams in nature, which I discussed in a piece I did earlier this year, all about the majestic mysteries of sea foam, please check it out, there aren't any known flying balloons not produced by humans. There are flying insects, spores, seeds, microbes, birds, bats, and perhaps others, and surely many of these contain airtight hollow spaces within them full of gas. But as far as I know, none of these, except for foam, sustain flight by mostly containing gas. And there isn't even any known foam in nature that contains lighter than air gas that can actually sustain flight by being lighter than the air around it. I suppose sea foam could do this in theory if it absorbed enough heat. For example, if it was dark-colored foam on a hot day, the expansion of the air inside would shorten the foam's lifespan, though. In any case, there's no way to tell for certain if this ever happens, and would it even be possible to call this a balloon? One moment, please.
All over with a thick coat of cobwebs laced with dew.
Now there is something
The
called
dogs are blinded
ballooning
by it when they
spiders,
attempt
and
to
they do
hunt.
fly.
At
In fact,
9
the way
a.m.,
that they fly
more
is really
cobwebs fall from the
interesting.
sky
They
and
basically go
continue
up to
until
a high
dusk.
place, stand on
They
their tippy
are,
toes,
quote,
and spin
perfect
strands of
flakes
silk
or
called
rags,
gossamer.
some near
And
an
then
inch
these
broad
strands are
and
carried
5
up
or
into the
6
air
long,
by the
which
difference
fell with a
between the
degree of
electrical charge
velocity
in the silk
that showed
and
they
that
were
in the
considerably heavier
atmosphere.
than the atmosphere.
Either electrical
Unquote.
charges or warm
The
winds,
fall
or perhaps a
extends to the
combination
neighboring
of both,
villages
then
in New
carry the spiders
Alresford and
away.
Bradley.
This behavior is usually called
Jeff Knox
ballooning,
writes,
but it's also
the
called
original
kiting.
vicarage does not exist.
Sometimes big
It was
groups of
rebuilt on the
spiders do
site in
this en masse.
1845. The only remaining part.
In one instance, researchers in South Africa observed the ballooning of the African social spider. These spiders live together in big colonies, and females will go ballooning together. What's interesting is that these spiders, as well as other ballooning spiders, will actually spin multiple threads at once. These threads then spread out. These threads then spread out and basically turn into kites about a meter wide. It's notable that the spiders flew when it was warm out, so it's quite likely that these gossamer kites were actually carried upward in part by warm rising air, kind of like a balloon made of silk. But are they truly balloons? I don't think so, not quite. But they are associated with UFOs and flying saucers. An argument can be made that spiders and other silk-producing little ones also produce bona fide Heinekian UFOs. In a report published in the journal Weather in 1949, a man named P.R. Bishop reported seeing strange star-like spheres of light at Port Hope, Ontario. Viewed through binoculars, Bishop said he also saw strands of gossamer, and he guessed these shiny spheres were actually balls of gossamer thread. If he was right, then dang. What other weird bug stuff in the sky gets reported as UFOs? Big hat tip to Jeff Knox for that one. Gossamer also certainly results in reports of angel hair, the strange ectoplasm-esque residue allegedly dropped by saucers. But in any case, yes, spiders do fly. They do it in big groups. It's really fantastic. And it's called ballooning. But no balloons. Now, as terrible a researcher as I am, I really want to research the topic of ancient balloons more at some point, because I found a lot of unreliable references online about stretchy inflatable balloons having been invented in the ancient world or even in prehistory. This is quite plausible since these simple balloons could have been made out of the organs of animals, such as pigs' bladders, but unfortunately, like I said, a lot of these sources appear to be unreliable. What I'm not finding are specific historical references to balloons of this type, but what I am finding are Reddit posts debunking some common and widely distributed claims. So I'm not even going to bother repeating those claims at this point, because as important as it is, I don't really like debunking. I like finding stuff that's both fantastic and true. For example, did you know that a flying nocturnal light was likely invented in China around 1700 years ago? Although nobody knows exactly when this flying device was first invented. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing at Vancouver guy's comment. Okay. Although nobody knows exactly when this flying device was first invented, it's thought to have been around the 3rd century CE. The device in question is called a sky lantern or a Kongming lantern because its invention is attributed to the military strategist named Zhuge Liang or Kongming. Legend has it that he used the sky lantern to confuse and frighten enemies. But a sky lantern is really simple. It's a lantern made of paper with a flame at the bottom of it. The flame heats up the air inside and causes the lantern to fly away. It's a literal, tiny hot air balloon. It's commonly thought these sky lanterns were used for sending signals in battle. And as we will find, even today the sky lantern poses a serious threat from the sky. Yet the earliest sky lanterns are truly shrouded in mystery. They're UFOs by dint of the fact that time has rendered them unidentified. The same can be said of many ancient flying machines. Now, animals' bladders were certainly used. Excuse me. Now, animals' bladders were certainly in use as balloons at least by the 1600s. For example, in an experiment that was tested by the Accademia del Cimento in Florence, Italy, they used a deflated bladder of a lamb to measure air pressure inside of a tube. They did this by forcing the air out of the tube using mercury. This would then cause the deflated bladder to bulge. Excuse me if that explanation is inaccurate. Anyway, before everybody started using the rubber balloon, first invented by Michael Faraday in 1824, there were still balloons. Balloons were used as toys by kids, as well as for traditional yearly festivals. Only they were made from the bladders of pigs. And by bladders, I mean the organs that pigs store their pee inside of. Pigs' bladders were also used as the inner lining of rugby balls and footballs, which is in part where we get one of the worst words in the English language, pigskin. I know, it's all very, very disgusting, and I hate it, because not only is it disgusting, but it's really hard to say when or even if such balloons were ever filled with hot air or lighter than air gas. So when did the bladders of animals first fly in the sky? The first urinary flying objects. It's a pee mystery. Another mystery, I feel, as someone who is not an expert, is when the first humans themselves flew, using the floaty powers of balloons. But what we do know is that the first recorded and widely acknowledged free flight by humans in a hot air balloon was performed by Pilatre de Rosier and Marquis d'Arlande. Excuse my pronunciation. This was in Paris on November 21st, 1783. The balloon was designed by the brothers Joseph Michel and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier. This was not the first hot air balloon flight. The brothers conducted multiple previous test flights. For example, in one historic flight, they placed animal passengers aboard to test how they would react. The 3 passengers included a duck, a rooster, and a sheep. And that sheep's name was Mont au Ciel, which means climb to the sky. The Montgolfier brothers' balloon tests immediately incited the imagination of Europe and America in 1783, with news articles describing people's excitement in newspapers and publications, and artists selling memorabilia decorated with balloons or commemorating important flights. Soon, more hot air balloon flights followed, and elaborate balloon flight hoaxes soon appeared in print too. In Connecticut in 1785, a man named Daniel Moore published a work with the full title, An Account of Count d'Artois and His Friend's Passage to the Moon in a Flying Machine called an Air Balloon, which was constructed in France and from which place they ascended, giving an account of the things or objects they had a view of in the passage, and likewise the circumstances of their landing in that planet, and conversing with the inhabitants, their languages, manners, religion, etc., with many other things very entertaining and well worth the attention of those who need it. At the same time the Montgolfiers launched their historic flights, the American Revolution was coming to an end, and the French Revolution was soon to follow. The latter was coupled with national anxieties rising into panics surrounding the purported gathering of rebel forces in 1789. According to historian of the French Revolution Georges Lefebvre, one French pastor asked his parishioners, quote, if their enemies had landed in balloons, unquote. But of course, people's excitement over balloons did not end with these revolutions. Edgar Allan Poe wrote 2 still very famous balloon hoaxes, the first being The Unparalleled Adventure of Hans Pfaall, published in 1835, which also involved a journey to the moon. And then in 1844, he published his story now known as just The Balloon Hoax. Unlike Hans Pfaall's trip to the moon, this story was quite a bit more plausible and convincing as a news story, while still being fantastic. It reports on the historic 3-day voyage of the airship Victoria across the Atlantic Ocean. As the 19th century proceeded, the public's imagination and fears surrounding balloons ebbed and flowed, but overall increased and gave way to fantasies and panics surrounding airships. And what is an airship but a balloon that one can steer? Jules Verne published Robur the Conqueror in 1886, a science fiction novel recounting the exploits of a villain who wields his awe-inspiring airship, the Albatross, to kidnap a group of balloonists. In 1891, newspapers reported a rash of phantom steerable balloon sightings in Russian Poland, thought to be the flying machines of German invaders. Then, 5 years later, strange and fantastical sightings of airships, as well as yet more airship hoaxes, spread like wildfire across the western United States. In 1896 and 1897, these reports started on the West Coast and then spread out through the Midwest. This led to the first report of a crashed alien spacecraft and many of the other tropes and cultural phenoms that we associate with modern-day flying saucer reports. If you're interested in this strange pre-saucer era wave of airship sightings, be sure to check out my piece devoted to it in Ufos number 7. If the mid to late 20th century was the era of phantom flying saucers, then the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th were the era of phantom flying airships. And these airship sightings only continued in waves scattered throughout the globe in the following decades. At the same time, fantastical airships portrayed in popular film and media, such as the films of Georges Méliès and Edwin S. Porter, And the fantastical phantom airship reports only petered out sometime after World War I, when real German airships, the Zeppelins, conducted bomb raids on the UK in 1915 to 1917. And during the same time, airplanes were used for the first time in battle. In 1937, the infamous explosion of a Zeppelin airship called the Hindenburg in New Jersey served well to mark the end of the airship era. Lighter-than-air craft were soon viewed as largely impractical, and Zeppelins used for air travel were entirely supplanted by enormous passenger planes in the following decades. Yet even today, balloons are coupled to fears of foreign invaders, advanced secret technologies developed or investigated in secret, and even reported as UFOs. In early 2023, a Chinese spy balloon spent a week flying over US airspace before being shot down by an F-22 Raptor. In the second episode of the UFO Detox Hour, I reported on a 2022 video of an orb shot by a military drone somewhere in the Middle East. A group of independent researchers called Bellingcat, who investigated the so-called Middle East object, concluded that it was likely a regular Mylar party balloon. There is no shortage of other modern UFO sightings that either definitely were caused by balloons or else very well could have been, such as the famous Amaranth case that we talked about in Ufos Chat on August 25th. In this case, from 1982, a cell biology student in France reported witnessing a flying saucer about the size and shape of a Mylar balloon descend on his garden, where it floated for a while and then took off. Though investigators at the time concluded this close encounter of the second kind could not be explained, a re-examination from the reliability of UFO witness testimony published last year concludes that what this witness saw was in fact very likely a Mylar balloon. Its movements could have easily been caused by changes in temperature and air pressure, and its apparent ability to levitate in one spot was likely just down to it resting on overgrown hollyhocks. As we discussed previously on Ufos Chat, and as I will further support later, this quite fantastic explanation is not nearly as outlandish as it at first seems. Heck, even Roswell was balloons. Yes, you know that time when a flying saucer supposedly crashed on the ranch of Mac Brazel near Roswell, New Mexico in the summer of 1947, and then it was reported in newspapers only for the US Army Air Forces to quickly retract the story? Well, sorry buddies, that was definitely balloons, and not flying saucers. Specifically, it was the debris from a Project Mogul balloon train. These balloon trains were secretly being used by the US military to detect nuclear detonation tests by the Soviet Union. Yep, that's right. Even Roswell was balloons. So, what have we learned so far? The history of balloons is somewhat shrouded by time and mystery. Have animals or plants ever become wild balloonists? Are there tiny animal balloonists in the sky right now? Nobody knows for sure. There are ballooning spiders, but really they don't actually use balloons. They use kites made of gossamer, a subtle, albeit fantastical distinction. There's no clear evidence that actual ballooning animals or plants exist in our skies. However, at some point in ancient times, perhaps in prehistory among a group of cave people, someone somewhere decided to take the bladder of some poor animal and inflate it with air. The hypothetical first cave balloon. Perhaps at some point one of these cave balloons flew off into the sky. But flying balloons didn't really become popular, as far as we know, until around the 3rd century with the invention of the sky lantern. Already at this time, the hot air balloon was probably being used to inspire shock and awe at the battlefront. Then, beginning in 1783, the Western world's imagination came under the grip of balloonmania, when history recorded the first humans carried aloft by hot air balloons. Balloons became tied to the fantasies of a future driven by technological innovation, as well as fears of ballooning invaders from the skies. The hot air balloon led to the steerable balloon, the airship, and thus the modern UFO era did not begin in 1947. It really began sometime in the late 18th century, around the time of the French and American Revolutions. It then reached a fever pitch in 1896 and 1897 with the Great American Airship Wave. After airships went out of fashion during the first two world wars, After airships went out of fashion during the first two world wars, phantom balloons and airships were supplanted by phantom flying saucers, but balloons still lived on in the shadow of the new saucer colossus. People still reported balloons as mysterious craft, either made by foreign adversaries or by aliens from another planet. Even Roswell was balloons, and indeed balloons still show up today in sky phantom reports, just as they did in olden times, both as a high-tech military threat and as a stimulus of UFO reports. Balloons still stroke excuse me. Balloons still stoke our fears and provoke our imaginations just as they did in centuries past. It's just they do it more quietly now, as most people today are unaware of their true significance. The more things stay the same, the more they change. But there is one question I have not yet answered. Why are balloons a threat? Why are they not just a menace, but truly a massive danger lurking in our skies at every moment? Why are they so much more dangerous than they were in 1897 when everyone was talking about them? Were you expecting me to end on a cliffhanger? Yeah, I wasn't either. But be sure to tune in for part 2 of Balloons, a Flying Menace, on the next UFO Sunset.
Balloons.
And now over to you, Luis. Or, yes, Luis.
Yep.
One moment. Sorry. Okay. Here we go.
Alien.
Why is it doing that? That's weird. Sorry, hold on a second. I'm having technical issues. It's not letting me share my screen for some reason.
Oh.
Why? It's weird.
Well, you're figuring that out. I'll just point out, if people don't want to read that full book on Moonwatch I recommended, he's got a paper called Amateur Scientists, the International Geophysical Year, and the Ambitions of Fred Whipple. That's kind of covers what I talked about and a lot more. That's not that long, that you can find in my thread as well. I think the Raelians are just giving you technical difficulties because they don't want you to debunk their nonsense.
And by the way, there's a pretty good treatment of airships in After the Flying Saucers came by Greg Egesian.
Yeah.
Egesian, yeah.
I'm not actually able to share the document for some reason. I don't know why it's not letting me share it. It's never done this before. Can you actually share it, Jeff? Is that all right?
I'm not sure. Let me see. I've never done that before, so let me.
Okay.
If not, I can still, if it doesn't work, I can still lead the discussion and you guys can chip in.
Yeah. Why not? Well, you can. Why don't you start with that, and then we can see if I can add it. Okay.
I'll just give you a couple minutes. I can't present, can I? Oh, here we go. Yeah. So Susan Palmer, who I've mentioned before in the context of a paper in this book. The author, I can't remember who the previous author was, but they were talking about Rael, and they mentioned Susan Palmer. And but this is Susan Palmer's contribution to the book. So she looks at the Raelian, well, she tries to look at Rael himself, Claude Verrilhorn, and as a individual case, you know, and let me just say something about the abstract here. So she says, since the focus here is not on the social consequences of Rael's testimony, but rather on the authenticity of the witness statement itself, the standard social scientific method of bracketing the faith claims of mystics or founders of new religions has not been applied here. Rather, this researcher proposes to reverse the target of bracketing, to ignore the social context, and to focus directly on Rael and his testimony as a case of the problems and questions that arise around the character of the witness to a UFO encounter. She doesn't really clearly explain what's meant by bracketing. That's a sort of relatively obscure, I mean, it's not obscure within the social sciences, I guess, but like when you're just introducing it here, it would be useful if she could expand on it a bit more. Do you either of you guys really understand that term?
I think it's like what we were talking about in the last episode of like the phenomenological reduction method is like you bracket off like whether or not the stuff's true or real or not. Like you're not really trying to like address that, like, and you're just trying to study the phenomenological features of like the event, as opposed to like trying to determine whether there's any truth in the faith of these things. Like you just kind of bracket that off to the side and not pay like.
Okay. All right. Yeah. That's helpful actually. Otherwise it might seem a bit obscure to listeners or to readers. So, and she was actually embedded for a time, I believe, in the movement, and she was getting information directly from them, I think, if I recall correctly. But so some of the keywords here: Rael, UFO, bracketing, and new religion. So the Raelism or Raelianism became a new religious movement in the 20th century, and it's still actually going on, but it's more at a lower level now, but still there's many adherents around the world. Now, starts off here with a sort of important observation that the UFO itself is the object that scientific ufology seeks to investigate, but the experience of sighting a UFO undergoes a number of refractions before reaching the investigator as a witness report. So in other words, the witness is not a pure detection device or sensor. He or she is very much embedded in a social context and brings a lot of psychological and social baggage with them, involving perception, memory, education, motivation, etc., which are listed there. And that's, of course, interesting in itself, and that can tell us about why certain movements catch on and others don't, and of course why witnesses, or experiences have these experiences or certain elements become prominent in their stories. So this scheme wherein the witness functions partly as observer and partly as instrument places great importance on the witness, but an even more daunting and complex challenge is posed by a UFO witness whose report is not just some astonished testimony collected by a police officer or UFO research organization, but turns out to be a religious tract, a kind of New Testament intended to gather and inspire a community of believers, which is like what happens with Raelism, because Claude Verrilhon, who eventually named himself Rael after his first supposed UFO or close encounter, renamed himself as Rael. He describes CE3 and CE4 experiences in his, well, at least CE3 experiences in his first book from 1974. But then Susan asks, is there really such a marked difference between the garden variety UFO witness and the UFO prophet? One can trace back a long history of religious or spiritual dimensions associated with the UFO experience. Again, Jacques Vallée can serve as an instructive example. In his 1975, The Invisible College, he turns his attention from the unidentified flying object to the subject of the witness. So this shift is very important. What witnesses often report are parapsychological phenomena like missing time, telepathy, etc. And authors like Vallée have certainly emphasized those supposed high strangeness features in UFO encounters. One need not invoke parapsychological considerations to legitimate the claim that the UFO encounter can be understood as a type of religious experience, as has been done for decades. Works like James R. Lewis's The Gods Have Landed, New Religions from Other Worlds, and the more popular, if less scholarly, American Cosmic by Diana Pasulka. Nevertheless, there are serious objections to reflecting on, in this case, Rael in the context of his claims as a contactee, one who describes contact and communication with ETs. The UFO witness is the source of the sighting report and becomes a foundational element, however problematic, of ufology. An essential task is to determine the veracity of the report, which requires scrutiny of the witness. In the context of ufological research, there's nothing particularly special about Claude Verrilhon. His report is merely another data point among thousands. Paradoxically, what makes his testimony significant for sociologists or scholars in the humanities serves to discourage efforts to assess its veracity. The social scientific approach is to study the effects of his testimony, such as the production and expansion of a new religious movement, quite apart from any fact regarding its truth value, so whether it actually happened or not, or even whether he believes that it happened. So the question of the authenticity of his testimony is thus bracketed for the sake of focusing on its social significance. But Susan proposes to reverse this bracketing and focus instead on Rael as a case study of the kinds of problems and questions arising around the character of the witness of an encounter or experiencer. However much as scientific ufology might want to reduce witness accounts to impersonal data points, this desire does injustice to the intractable fact of an irreducible particularity of each witness, which needs to be accounted for. So in this article, Rael is the focus of study, and Susan Palmer proposes to do this in 6 steps. So brief biography of the witness, witness report of Rael and confirmations thereof will be scrutinized. The statements and opinions of character witnesses personally acquainted with him, like friends, family, close associates. Survey of the more general reactions of those personally unacquainted with him, such as journalists, anti-cultists, rank and file Raelians, and ufologists. The context of Rael's CE3 experience, the socio-historical milieu of recent OVNI sightings in France, will be examined, as well as the possible influence of contemporary ufologists on his writings. So it is looking at the social context, but it's asking how might it have played into his encounter report, or like the elements that he emphasized in it. And finally, the question of how one might interpret his testimony will be addressed. So really, she's allowing for the possibility that he did actually have a genuine encounter, even if some parts of his story, obviously, as we saw previously, are problematic. I do feel that she kind of, the extent to which she kind of downplays how serious the narrative changes among the books that he wrote are, I think that's kind of a serious problem in her own analysis. I think that they're more problematic than she makes out. It's not like just somebody who's recounting something and then obviously some parts of the story change a little bit here and there. That's to be expected. But I think that his the ways that he contradicted himself through the books and the ways that his story kind of evolved point to, I think, very clearly fraud. So, it is conceivable that he did have a genuine experience, but personally, I don't think he did. But anyway,
I was going to point out, if people remember the last chapters we talked about, there's a kind of a similar argument made against Parker Hickson, I'm forgetting which one, but that even Randall said like the narrative changes cannot, that he just, that of the story over time, the changes he kept making, like could not be explained just by simply, forgetting little details here and there. It was obviously a bit of molding going on in, response to kind of feedback he was getting when he was telling his story. And I agree. Like you can't ignore the fact that like he changes stuff in his books, like how significantly he changes stuff repeatedly through his different books. Like I think that plays a pretty important deal as well.
Yeah, and they're important things as well.
Yeah,
which are kind of central to the narrative. It's not just like little fringe things. But she talks here about the witness himself. So he was born, Claude Verilhorn, born in 1946 in Ambert in France. In his 1975 book, which is here, it's just given in French. I can't read that, but he describes growing up with the historical and philosophical influences peculiar to France. So in France, it was kind of a very secular society. They really lean heavily into scientific thought, kind of culturally, or they become culturally suspicious of religion. So it's a very secular, if not outright atheist type of culture. Although that's, of course, there's many religious believers, but I guess even they are sort of still a little bit suspicious of religion. So he grew up in that sort of context, right? And he started off as a pop singer on the streets of Paris. He married a nurse. He had 2 kids. He then founded a car racing magazine called Autopop. And he was doing okay with that for a while, but then that sort of wasn't much of a lucrative venture for him because of certain social events in France. And 3 months later, at age 27, after there was an effect that effectively banned speeding on the highways, I guess that stopped him from really testing sports cars properly or something. I think there was also the oil crisis, wasn't there, circa that time, which put a dampener on motor racing. But he experienced a close encounter of the third kind shortly after those issues. And he was 27. Testimony, so the actual testimony that his first encounter, he sort of helicopter-like craft descending soundlessly, and from it emerged a 1.2 meter tall entity, and which he describes as the Eloha. That's a singular for Elohim, which is a biblical reference because he really mixes biblical stories with science to create a kind of atheist atheistic creationism, where the aliens are our creators, right? But he describes as being very, kind of diminutive, greenish tinge, almond-shaped eyes, long black hair, and a small black beard. Interestingly, and the being tells him about the true meaning of the Bible, the true meaning of Genesis, the creation myth in the Bible, the Eloha dub Virilhorn Rael, and revealed the secrets of humanity's true origins. That the first humans were created or implanted thousands of years ago on this once barren planet by extraterrestrial scientists. And that sort of starts off the group's obsession with DNA and cloning, which would later become something that they encourage and are very much in favor of. And then he wrote other books where he expands on this sort of on the planet in which the aliens live and their social system and what they do, their level of technology and how they organize their society. That they've got something called geniocracy, where very wise, ingenious people lead and everybody else sort of follows. So it's very hierarchical in that sense. And he also, by the way, mentioned angel hair, which I think was alluded to earlier tonight. That one of these contact experiences he had involved the spacecraft. I think two of them were emitting angel hair. So sort of a cottony substance that melts when you touch it. That's been a staple of UFO lore for a long time. The character witnesses, so friends and family have chimed in. There's actually a website which is by former aliens, and they sort of give their take on whether they think Rael is credible or not, and many of them say that is not. Interestingly, a lot of these people who were in the cult or the sect, whatever you want to call it, they still believe in the mythos. Like they still believe that he was chosen by the Elohim to lead humanity, and the sort of the pantheon of gods and things in that religion. They still believe that stuff, but they have fallen out of favor with him for various reasons, sometimes personal. One of them had to choose between the group and his girlfriend, so he chose his girlfriend and he left. And other people have, for various reasons, have left the group as well. But many of them have maintained their faith in the tenets of the religion, which I found really interesting.
Not the ex-wife didn't, though, right? I mean, she seemed pretty critical that he was kind of making stuff up, and
yeah. Certainly some people just like flat out said, he's just making stuff up, and they don't believe in that stuff. But others do.
Wanted to have lots of sex.
Yeah, right. That's what he was driven by. His wife Marie Paul, whom he married in Paris in 1970. She was pregnant with the first child in 1973, and he was still with his magazine Autopop. And she says that basically he just invented realism to have more sex and satisfy his enormous ego and need to be worshipped, right? And he asks, is he mad? No, I don't think so. I think he's devious, crafty, manipulative, and very, very clever, which is my view as well. But anyway, she was closer to the events. And other people have said similar things. His aunt, Therese Virilhorn, kind of laments that he turned out this way, but she's like kind of, well, people change, but you still have to love them, sort of thing. And there was also, was it in this section where his friends talk about how they sort of concocted, I think it's later on, they concocted the mythos. But the next part here is about public responses. So in France, as I mentioned, there was like a very strong secular, almost anti-religious mood. And there's many people in France who are strongly against cults and that sort of thing. But there's a broad swathe of society in France which was opposing his writings, including anti-cultists, some former members, Catholic priests, journalists, and anonymous jokers. And Raoul is a frequent target of scorn and derision in the French media. And there's also a website devoted entirely to discrediting Raoul and the Raelians. That's by a French journalist or anti-cultist. The Raelian movement had, within 3 years of its founding, been perceived as a threat to public order, and it was basically eventually pushed out. And then they had to set up shop, I think where was it first, in America, or was it in Quebec? I forget.
I don't know if they were in America first. Ultimately, they ended up in Quebec.
Yeah. Right. And they were always talking about the importance of religious freedom. So, they were saying that in France, there's no religious freedom because the authorities and the broader culture sort of ganged up on them. And then in either Canada or America, they said the same thing. But I mean, there was the controversy in America to do with cloning. So they sort of fell out of favor in America. I guess it was America first, and then they went to Canada. But anyway, so there was this sort of social backlash against them. Many controversies, including exploitation of women and all that sort of unfortunate stuff. Some high-ranking Raelians defecting from the group, and some books also written by former members. And then, it's mentioned that none of these apostates have expressed doubts concerning the existence of the Elohim as depicted by Raoul, nor do they question Raoul's claim to be a UFO witness, a messenger, or a messiah chosen by the Elohim. So certainly something very compelling was, passed on to them, or that they felt about the core ideas, enough for them to still cling on to those ideas despite their falling out with the lead figure. The ufological context. So there was a lot of UFO stuff going on in France, even back into the 19th century. Some things which you could include as part of a UFO subculture, but depends like how you lump that in, because this was before 1947 when the modern UFO age proper started. But you can find sort of airship type mysteries and things like that, aerial phenomena which happened well before that. But certainly in France, UFOs became very popular. There was a rash of sightings occurring in the 50s. By the 1970s, France was truly in the throes of a flying saucer fever, and that was sort of the perfect time and backdrop for Verrilhorn to, concoct this story. And he apparently did it with a bunch of friends who, he got together in a pub, they got drunk, and they kind of basically concocted the idea, which Verrilhorn found very, very clever and ultimately lucrative. But the other ones were sort of half joking about that. They weren't necessarily serious, but he got he really saw that as a good idea. So a lot of the stuff in his publications is not original. Obviously, it's clearly plagiarized from ancient astronaut theory, which is itself highly plagiarized. So Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken, which came out in 1969, did not attribute certain ideas to Robert Cherew's 1963 book, 100,000 Years of Man's Unknown History, which had already sort of promoted a bunch of ancient astronauts ideas. So basically, Raoul was doing what von Daniken was doing, namely plagiarism, and not citing the source of these ideas. So there was other ufologists like Jean Sandy, Serge Houghton, and Jacques Bergier, who had written books about human civilization originating in an ancient colonial outpost of ET pioneers and scientists. These all predated Raoul's first 1974 book. So obviously that's problematic. but it's still very interesting to ask, as Susan Palmer does, like, why these myths and not other ones? What is it about these ideas that caught on in his mind? And then, if we want to look at that, the broader Raelian movement, what is it that made those ideas compelling? And certainly, it was something to do with the technological fixation at the time, and the fears of nuclear war, nuclear contamination, etc. So existential issues being expressed through the motif of the UFO and ancient astronauts lore. And that's whether or not, he had a genuine experience. So we can still ask the question, why those ideas and not other ones, even if the precipitating, the supposed precipitating event never happened. Then there's a section theorizing the C3. So we might analyze the witness's experience within the framework supplied by psychoanalysts and psychologists of religion, and asking whether contactees are fantasy-prone people, easily influenced by cultural trends. We might approach Rael as a mystic. So William James's model of the mystical experience. So things like ineffability, noetic quality, transiency, and passivity. So those were all present in his experience. And we might cite Jung's model of the collective unconscious as a storehouse of religious ideas and symbols. But I guess she sort of takes a different tack. Now, she's written a pretty important article with Brian Sentes about the Raelian movement as a sort of excellent case study in a collective dream in modern society about technology. So UFOs and aliens are popular because of how we treat technology. So in the conclusion, she's basically going through this stuff again, and I don't know if she makes a really strong point, actually. I think it's a little bit weak, just because, again, it's so clear to me, at least, and you too, Jeff, that he did make this up. There probably was no initial experience, but still, there could have been. I mean, it is conceivable, and it's important to ask, like, why did he refract that experience through certain ideas, namely the ones that he promoted with technology and DNA, alien creators and so on. So that's still a very important topic.
Yeah.
That the UFO is deeply disruptive, that Rael had his kind of experience is sort of simple in a way. So she's saying that maybe that adds veracity to it in terms of him believing that he had an experience, because other religious people in history have had these sort of experiences which are very similar in some ways, and they've just got a few core narrative elements, and his does as well. So maybe because he didn't try to elaborate it too much, that might actually give some veracity to his claim. So, but I'm not really convinced by that, to be honest. But still, she does raise a very interesting point about why certain ideas become prominent and others don't, and that we do have to treat the UFO witness as an individual, not just another data point, because each person is unique. They come at this with their own experiences and beliefs, predispositions, emotions, etc. So we have to kind of, allow that they could have had an experience, even if they do change elements of their story over time. That's what I wanted to say, I think.
Yep. Is Rael still alive? I don't
remember.
Yeah,
he's living in Japan. He's actually got a branch of his sect there right now.
Yeah. I think because he really borrowed heavily from the Bible. He basically just kind of did a little biblical hermeneutics and kind of reinterpreted the Bible with the technological guys, replacing it with gene science and scientists and, advanced planets, and which I've, said that I think that's, for some people, that's kind of what the whole UFO topic kind of fulfills, like almost kind of like a religious need that's been updated to get rid of more of the, paranormal aspects and make it more scientific. And so like UFOs are kind of like a scientific religion, that doesn't require believing in paranormal and ghosts, but just aliens and science that may be more advanced than us, but is still, within the realm of possibility. And so he didn't really go that far with his what he said. He just kind of changed things around a bit. It's a weird guy. Yeah, I recommend that book, The Gods Have Landed, edited by James Lewis. Great book full of chapters about UFO religious stuff. Susan Palmer has a chapter in here called Women in the Raelian Movement, New Religious Experiments in Gender and Authority. And I mentioned the last time we talked about Rael, the book Alien Worlds by Diana Tumenia has that chapter by Brian Sentes and Susanna Palmer called Presumed Imminent, I think is the name of the chapter. Yeah. That people should check out. So, and the Netflix series.
The Netflix series, where he does, they do show his Japanese, caper right now. Kind of that really made me angry, actually, because there's a part there where they're sort of setting up the camera and he's coming in to sit down and his assistants are helping him, and he kind of barks at one of his assistants, at one of the Japanese girls, and you can just tell like the power dynamic there is so lopsided and ridiculous, and goes against everything that they say about love and human equality.
It's pretty much that way in every cult documentary or docuseries I watch. Yeah, it's and then you can't forget Kanye West wearing the Raelian swastika, and that going all over Twitter a year or two ago. And one of the things the chapter pointed out was that it wasn't, the controversies weren't really about his beliefs that he was a contactee or talking to aliens. It was basically when he was taking those beliefs and, the effects they had on that, they pushed them on society and trying to like change things with those beliefs, People had issue with the swastika on the Star of David. It wasn't it wasn't the alien beliefs that people really cared about. It was the other crap. So.
Yeah, he would have been almost completely forgotten if not for his the effect of the cult.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I'm not really sure I understand your guys' criticism about Palmer's approach. I mean, I don't think that using, bracketing in this way rejects the possibility of critiquing the contradictions in the story. I think that that she's just saying that it's useful to use this approach of looking at Rael as a person, Borrelone as a person in context. So I don't know. Maybe you could clarify that for me, or maybe
the impression I got was just that she's downplaying the degree of contradiction in the books that he wrote. Starting from 1974 onwards, there were some pretty strong contradictions and things that don't make sense. So it's just like the degree of contradiction.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I do think that she was downplaying the contradictions a little bit too. But at the same time, I think it kind of doesn't really matter if she's bracketing off the the testimony. I mean, because she's really not focusing on the testimony. That's really not the main.
She was mostly just looking at its effect. What, like, they talk about the reception history of something over time. How not whether or not there's truth to it, but how his story, whether it was true or not, affected the people around him, society, and even him himself.
But I thought that she was doing the opposite of that. That she was discounting that stuff and just looking at him as a
Well, yeah.
Well,
I agree. There's some points I think she could be more clear, and it doesn't kind of wrap it up as nice as I would like. But
yeah, I didn't really spend enough time with this to fully absorb it. I'm sorry. I don't know. Maybe we can talk about it more next week.
I just think that she at least makes a good point, and a point that like we've talked about repeatedly is that witnesses are not a recording instrument. Like there's all sorts of external factors that come into play into not only just what they remember, what they report to people, like what they experience, and you can't think of them as a recording instrument, like a camera, that's recording accurate data. You've got to look at all the different influences and cultural factors and everything else that play in a sighting. And that's very important. All right.
Okay. So V showed up, who was here last week, and I kind of actually wanted to talk about gender more next week because I think there are some errors that I made, but I also wanted to respond to some of the things that Luis and also V talked about in response to what I was saying last week. So
cool.
So yeah. And Amy is saying, if digital cameras didn't exist, would we still have orbs?
Well, they pick up on non-digital cameras.
Yeah, I think a lot of orbs are just caused by when a light is reflected off of like dust or something, but it's out of focus, and then it kind of blows up into the shape of the aperture, pretty much.
And it also kind of depends what people mean by orbs. Like there's different ambiguous, right? Like it's kind of like also when people say like UFOs and they call the shape like a sphere, but really all that generally is going to mean circle, sphere, orb is that it's an indefinable point light source, distant point light source that you can't see anything else. Any point of light's going to look like any like fuzzy point of light is going to look like a sphere or a ball or an orb, like, so as like a descriptor, I find that stuff almost useless. Like unless you're claiming you saw it like right in front of your face, like so close, like, and it was an actual orb. Most of the time when people say they saw an orb or a sphere or a circular craft, like really all they saw was a light. They don't know what the actual structure of the thing was.
We're going to talk about it next. We're going to talk about gender again next week. What is this gray theory that you're talking about here, if you don't mind my asking? Does that have to do with the grays? Is that what you're talking about?
The grays are humans from the future.
Oh, okay.
I saw that movie on the Sci-Fi Channel Saturday movie in the 90s. There was some movie where the grays were actually just humans from the future, and they came back. And I forget what it's called. I want to watch it again. It was kind of cool.
Yeah, the future people taking our jobs.
Yeah. There's a book by Mark Davenport called Visitors from Time about that, and of course Michael Masters and his what does he call it? Tempestural theory or extratempestural theory. Yeah.
Trump should set up a temporal wall to protect our jobs from the future people.
Look at all these David, Michael Masters little flyers and swag.
Nice.
Actually, H.G. Wells was really the first person to come up with that theory. But before there was
the archetypal grays. You know, that he had that. He wrote an article describing how the ancestors of humans would have these really huge heads, and you know, that their limbs and the other parts of their bodies would kind of be, you know, more you know, become weaker and smaller because they weren't as necessary. And he basically kind of invented some of the features of what would later become gray aliens, I feel like.
I mean, I've seen like projections that like you know, like biological anthropologists and people like that have done, like, of what future humans will look like, and where they've simulated it, and like they do tend to have like larger eyes, you know, and perhaps a little bit bigger of a skull, but they're still not very gray looking, like, realistically. I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, those projections, they depend on so many assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We've got no idea how humans will actually evolve because it depends on the conditions.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah, you can only really speculate. And I think H.G. Wells was probably aware of that as well.
Yeah, that book kind of reminds me. I've got a book about dragons, like if they were real, like the author is treating them as like historical accounts of dragons, like
Yeah.
they were real creatures, and like, can you make an animal that floats by using like hydrogen gas or something from its bones? And it sort of feels like that.
Which relates to what I was talking about wild balloons. Maybe if dragons existed, they would be wild balloons.
Yep.
Or wild airships, I guess.
Well,
that book is called The Natural History of Dragons. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think so.
I used to have another one. It's called A Natural History of Dragons and Unicorns. And it kind of goes into the taxonomy of dragons and unicorns from around the world. It's pretty cool.
I like some of those like speculative animal books that people like make, particularly like when they're real scientists that kind of like come up with what like some of these things might kind of look like. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Yeah. Pretty interesting.
Oh, I feel like there was something else I wanted to say. You know, it was probably just to apologize for something. But I don't remember. Yeah, I had some other thing I wanted to bring up, but anyway, we're definitely going to be having a lot to talk about next week. We're probably going to talk more about this chapter, and then we're also going to cover the next 2 chapters of reliability. And Jeff is going to be talking about some more UFO cases associated with Moonwatch. And yeah, it's going to be a great chat show. And then the week after that, we'll be talking more about balloons and why they're a threat.
The only other thing to mention, perhaps, is that yesterday was the 2-year anniversary of Today in UFO History. I have been doing my daily history post for 2 years straight. That's what, 730 days, 731 days now. Something like 3,900 individual cases or historical events from history posted every day over the last 2 years. So, yeah.
Congratulations. Also want to thank Amy, since you're here. I don't know if I've already done this, but thank you for being our 100th subscriber.
She's so informative too. So much knowledge, like amazing amount of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. So much knowledge about space and aeronautics and aeronautical science and history. Really great, really wonderful comments in this episode in particular, Amy.
Yeah, I wish I could pay more attention to the comments, but it's like when I'm doing my thing, like it's hard for me to like keep track on what else is going on. Like I can't watch the chat, like, because then I'll get confused. So I kind of miss some of it until after I'm done. But yeah, a lot of great comments today.
Yeah, the only reason I saw your one comment is because for some reason it turned blue in StreamYard. I don't know why. You're just debunker. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, bro. Roswell was balloons. Yeah, one other thing is that actually UFOs and well, this whole entire project, the UFO Detox Hour, as well as UFO Sunset, coming up on 1 year.
Yes,
It,
next
pretty
month.
soon.
Yeah. Next couple weeks.
Month.
Couple weeks, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, all right.
Very cool.
And for our final story, a new book coming out will commemorate Flaco the Owl. A new book by nature writer David Gessner will be released this coming February, all about the life of Flaco, the famous Eurasian eagle owl of New York City. The book is titled The Book of Flaco, the World's Most Famous Bird, and is available for pre-order through Blair Publishing. In February of 2023, Flaco was released from the Central Park Zoo when their enclosure was cut open, and sightings of the owl quickly turned them into a local celebrity. Flaco then lived freely in the city for a year and passed away in February of this year after flying into a building. Pix News 11 reported, according to a post-mortem report issued by the Central Park Zoo in March, Flaco carried a virus from eating pigeons, as well as various rodenticides, which likely played a factor in their death. Flaco, you are a hero to us all, and your spirit lives on in our hearts.
Gangster. Flaco, the mob boss, he escaped prison, went wild for a bit, fortunately got sick and died.
Yeah. It's what happens when you live in New York City.
Yep. And when wild animals get out of their native environments and are kept in zoos. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, zoos are not all bad. However, a lot of really important conservation science happens in zoos, and also a lot of species that can't survive in the wild are, they're basically rescued by zoos, and they can sometimes their populations are restored, which is a really important part of the rewilding efforts going on right now.
Cool.
Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, UFO Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit that notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description. Here at UFOS, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not necessarily those of UFOS, who is not a person and has no views, or the other hosts. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found in the Funny Papers. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, or the entire world will fall apart due to a temporal paradox. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he doesn't make any money off of it. Hardly any money off of it, I should say. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. All right. One moment, please.
It's H.G. Wells' birthday yesterday.
Oh, I did not know that. Happy birthday, HG.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, V. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Swink McLeod. Hopefully, I'm not.
Mystery Cat, for your emotional support today.
Thank you, Mystery Cat. Thank you, Merge.
Yes, Merge.
For your honkiness.
He almost bit me on the ass today. I had to run away from him. He was coming straight at me. Oh, punk.
Yeah, well, he's mad at you because you're feeding him puffed pancakes all the time, and he wants healthy food.
Well, he's eating cat food. He stole the cat food.
He stole the cat.
I put a can out, and he chases the cat off, and he sticks his nose in there and starts gobbling it up.
Gooses are just geese, and geese, not gooses. Although I think we should just change it to gooses because that sounds funnier.
Yeah, I like gooses better.
Geese have attitudes, and they're basically just dinosaurs with a lot of chutzpah.
There was a two nights ago 2-hour standoff between a raccoon and a goose outside my bedroom window.
Yeah, and then raccoon versus goose, who will win?
Like, raccoon kept wanting to take baths in her pool, and goose like rah, rah, like doing her squawking deal, and raccoon runs off, and like for 2 hours I sit there, the goose is squawking at it. Sometimes I'll look out the window, the raccoon's at the pool, and the goose is standing a little bit away. Other times the goose is in the pool and the raccoon's standing away waiting for the goose to leave. Like, it was a whole goose raccoon standoff here the other day.
Oh, also, before I forgot, thank you to Jeff's Patreon, Jeff's patrons on Patreon, Ben and Kevin. Thank you so much for your support.
Cool.
All right. And in the words of the disc, give me the morning, give me the afternoon, the night,